So in general, journalists face a lot of traumatic events, and they can be, we often think about war correspondents and we think about journalists who are in hostile environments, but there are other kinds of adverse experiences and traumatic events that journalists experience. We often don't think about the community reporter who goes out into the field into situations of violence and crime. And in fact, what we know from statistics is probably more journalists are exposed to that everyday crime and violence. One question I get asked a lot is, has the amount of exposure, traumatic exposure, increased for journalists over the past few years? And I think in some ways it has, and in some ways it hasn't. So let's start with thinking about war correspondents or people in conflict zones. I think at some level it hasn't, because we've long had journalists in conflict zones covering horrible things. But what's unique in the conflict zones now is that journalists are no longer protected, they're targeted. So there's actual physical violence now being directed towards journalists and with impunity. So people are not being sought after, and I think it's becoming much more physically dangerous to be a journalist. So that adds a unique element to it. And it is something that the UN Security Council is looking at. It's an international problem. So yes, it has increased in that way. I think when it comes to day-to-day violence, that hasn't changed very much. Maybe our awareness of it has changed, but that hasn't changed very much. And so one of the questions I've been looking at is, so what's the impact? Journalists are exposed to traumatic events. Almost, the studies vary between 80 to 99% of journalists are exposed at some point in their career or within the last year even to an event that we would deem traumatic, a car accident, a horrible thing that happens. How many of them go on to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, or psychological difficulties? We know that the culture of journalists is one of particularly alcohol use. How is that related to this? How do people cope successfully? So a lot of our research has started to look at these kinds of issues, and it turns out that, on the one hand, journalists as a group are a pretty resilient tribe. Only a minority go on to develop difficulties. But it is a significant minority, and it is an occupational hazard. And the big question also in the field is, how do you deal with that, and what is the industry's responsibility for that?